Hi, everybody. Pastor Whitesel, St. John's in Columbia. This is our fifth talk on confirmation. I'm trying to keep them about 15 minutes. I don't really have a clock in front of me, so I'm kind of guessing on that. And what I'm trying to do right now is within the window of confirmation as an educational ministry of the church, providing the wherewithal for a person to make an informed decision about the Christian faith in general and their place in that community. We are walking through the traditional material, and the first thing that we wanted to stress was the business of the Bible. Now, the Bible is a specialized library of works. Some of them date back thousands of years and include things like when the children of Israel, as they called them, the Israelites, were coming out of Egypt, there was a miraculous experience where the army of Pharaoh was coming down on them and they were up against the Red Sea and it looked like we're going to get slaughtered. And God has Moses pray and lift his hands up, and the waters are parted, and the people of Israel are able to cross the Red Sea. And then when they all got to the other side, the water came back down on the pursuing Egyptians and killed them. And the people of Israel, the women of Israel, were celebrating this redemption that happened to them, and they were singing and dancing. And in the book of Exodus, we have that song. And when scholars look at it, they go, this is really old stuff. The way the words are used, the words that are used, and so forth. They go, this goes back a long way. And so we will study these books and try to figure out what did they say, what does it mean, and then from a faith perspective, what's it mean for me to do? Is there something here that God wants me to consider and act upon, and so forth? Classic questions to ask yourself every day when you're reading. We're recommending that you use a lectionary such as the one that's in the hymnal. We'll provide copies of that to you. I'll ask Teresa to send that out, and that you can literally sit there and read each assigned section for the day in less than 10 minutes. And so I would get a hymnal if I were you, and I would become familiar with the songs, and there's beautiful prayers in there that can be an encouragement, the lectionary to help you with the reading of the scriptures, and then read for about 10 minutes and do it every day. And honestly, 10 minutes a day, you'll read through the entire Bible in a year, and it will become something that you realize this specialized library was put together both by the Holy Spirit and the church in order for the disciple of Jesus Christ to get this full counsel of God, so that when they're making decisions in their lives, they have a better understanding of things. So we're encouraging that. We've walked through, we talked about reading the narrative parts, and starting in Genesis 12 with the story of Abraham. So Genesis gets you Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and their wives and their children. Then you get to the book of Exodus and you pick up the story of Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, and how God used them to lead the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, across the wilderness. And then I'm recommending that you jump to Joshua and keep following the story through where you have the story of the conquest of the land. Then Judges has 12 stories that talk about the life and the condition and so forth of the people in the land. It brings it up to Samuel, who I said was a judge and a prophet, one of the greatest people in the Bible, very significant and influential. And you read all about him and how God used him to pick and anoint and train the first king of Israel, Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, and then how Saul by disobedience was displaced, and God raised up David, the son of Jesse from the tribe of Judah, and eventually made a promise to him that one of his descendants would rule after him in perpetuity, and that descendant is called the Messiah, and it is the one of the main vehicles through the rest of the Old Testament, and comes to fruition when we realize that son of David is Jesus. So we walked you up through Samuel as a book. I told you that the scriptures say that David was a man after God's own heart, but that does not mean that he did not sin. He sinned in big ways, and when you're a king and you sin, it has ramifications for the whole nation, and God chastised him and disciplined him and sent prophets to him to try to keep him in line and so forth. And the only thing that you can say about David is that when he did finally realize his sin, he repented and God forgave him. He still had to work out the consequences of his actions, but not without sin. David had many wives and hundreds of concubines. Now, in order to understand this, we don't have concubinage in American society, in my lifetime anyway. It's on the fringe. You get jokes about, hey, go to Utah and pick up a wife or two. We're a monogamous society and have been for a long period of time. And what we don't realize is that in the ancient world, family ties were considered sacred and binding. And so someone like a king who had the money, first of all, to pay for this, would have a political marriage where to bring two countries together with a peace treaty or a mutual defense treaty or trade treaties and so forth, that they would seal that with a marriage. Sometimes the ruling monarch, sometimes the children of the ruling monarch with the children of another monarch. But David had a lot of wives that were these political types of connections. And so who was going to follow him? Like in England, the monarchy that we know the best, the Queen Elizabeth, it was primo progenitor, firstborn male. That's the way it's been done. Now it's firstborn child, but you have Elizabeth, and her oldest child is Charles. And when Elizabeth dies, Charles will become king. It's very clear, it's very simple, straightforward, as long as there is a legitimate heir. In David's case, he had hundreds of wives and concubines, and they all had children by him. And so who was to succeed him? So that story begins to come out in Kings and into, there's a book, we have it as 1st and 2nd Kings in Hebrew Bible, that's one book as well. And it tells the story of the death of David and the transition of power from David to his son Solomon. So there's only 3 kings of the united Israel. Solomon's the third. Solomon is the one who gets to build the temple in Jerusalem, which was the crowning distinctive characteristic of the Hebrew kingdom, or the Israelite kingdom. David wanted to do it. God said no, so David put money aside. He bought building supplies. He hired architects to design the place and all that kind of stuff, so that when Solomon came along to build the temple, it was kind of prefab, and he oversaw the construction of it, and he ruled over the 12 tribes 40 years, a generation. David was 40 years. Saul, I think, was close to 40 years. So you have this story being told out. In Kings, Solomon's reign is the last of the united kingdom. Here's a date for you to hold on to. David 1,000 years before Christ. And you know you're moving, the years are moving closer to the BC piece. And so Solomon's in the 950s to 900 time frame. They keep moving forward that way. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was to take over. Rehoboam was not particularly bright. So when it came time to consent to Rehoboam being the king, the people had some objections that they raised. Solomon had drafted everybody to do 40 days of manual labor for the crown, for all of his building, and the people resented it. They felt like it was an infringement on their lives, and that if he wanted to build something, he needed to pay for it. He took taxes, and he took this labor time. It was called a korban, and they wanted the korban eliminated. And so big national meeting, and they told Rehoboam, if you will lighten the load, brother, it's out of hand, lighten the load, we'll be glad to have you as king. So all of Solomon's advisors said to Rehoboam, what they're asking for is really reasonable, and we think that you need to say yes to it. But Rehoboam was a young man, and he had a bunch of friends that he was going to have as his advisors because they were a friendship group. And they said, no, this is where you really draw the line, Rehoboam. You got to tell them you're tough. And so he literally went to these people and said, you want me to lighten the load? You think my dad was tough? I got more toughness in my little finger than my dad had in his whole body. And so they said, well, we're out of here. And 10 of the 12 tribes, all of them from north of the tribal territory of Judah, walked. Okay? So Rehoboam is left as king of Judah, and the only people that he's got with him is the priests, who are the tribe of Levi. They don't have any territory. So he's got Jerusalem, he's got the temple that his father built, and he's got the tribal territory of Judah, which is about equal to the other 10. And so southern kingdom, northern kingdom, and they go their own way. And so the stories are told about the people of Israel now divided into these two political entities of the northern kingdom became known as Samaria, and the southern kingdom stayed as Judah, and they literally went their own way. The story gets kind of complicated, and you're going to read through it with Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles and Kings and so forth. So stick with the narrative books. But essentially what happens is the northern 10 tribes drift away from the covenant with Moses. They don't want their people going to Jerusalem to worship because it's in Judah, and they want to break the connection to Judah. So they create two sanctuaries, one at Dan in the north and another one at Bethel, and they put up golden calves, which go all the way back to the Exodus story and so forth. And so over generations, the people drift away from the worship of Yahweh, start worshiping all the foreign gods and so forth, and they get out from underneath the umbrella of the protection that God wants to give them, and they thumb their nose at him, they go their own way, and the natural and logical consequences of that start to come home to roost. The superpower that becomes the key player in the 700s before Christ. So we've gone from 1,000 with David, now we're in the 721 time frame, is called Assyria. And they are conquering everybody in the territory and stealing them blind and taxing them and all those kinds of things. And they come down and they wipe out the northern 10 tribes. So Samaria is destroyed by Assyria, and they take remnants of the population, and they scatter them all over their empire, and they're gone. The Assyrians also attack Judah, and they wipe out all the walled cities on the border, and they get to the capital of Jerusalem, and they've got it surrounded, and it's a horrible siege, and the people are trying to figure out what can we do to survive. And there's this small group of people centered around a prophet by the name of Isaiah, big book of Isaiah. The first part of the book of Isaiah is prophecies from this time with the Assyrians. Essentially, Isaiah told them, God's going to protect the city. Just hang in there. And what happened historically was one day the sentries were looking out over the walls, and the Assyrian camp looked different, and so they sent some patrols out, came back, and it's like, they're gone. They left all their tents and all that kind of stuff, and they just boogied back home, and they're just gone. And Jerusalem was spared. So, the northern kingdom is gone. The southern kingdom barely survives. And what happens next is the Assyrians get wiped out. And the next superpower in the region is Babylon, the Babylonians. And they are, Babylon is right next to what's modern day Baghdad. So that Iraq area, and they were conquering and so forth. And the king of Judah, what an idiot, he invited Babylonian ambassadors and gave them a guided tour and showed off all of the walls and the weapons and the treasury and the temple and all that kind of stuff, trying to impress these people. And they went home and said, we ought to knock them off and take their stuff. And so that's what happened. So in the 6th century, the 500s before Christ, the Babylonians come down, they surround the place, and this time they sack Jerusalem, and they burn the temple to the ground, and it's gone. And the people who were royalty or artisans that were skilled craftsmen, people that could read and write like the priests and so forth, they're all carried off into captivity in Babylon. And God promised them that this punishment would end in about 70 years, and that a remnant of them would be able to come back to Jerusalem and start over. So this captivity in Babylon, this is something that took me a long time to realize, and I said, hear me on this, okay? This is really important. The Babylonian exile, as it's called, and the return to the land is as big a deal in the Bible as coming out of Egypt, okay? So you have the Egypt and Babylon pieces, and they are both of great importance. All the prophetic books of the Bible have to do with different individuals being raised up by God who are to speak to the national problem of the Assyrians or the Babylonians, okay? So let's just pick one book, maybe two. Isaiah is actually three different things under one title. From book 1 through 39 is that time when Assyria was surrounding the city of Jerusalem. 40 through about 55 is another, call it the school of Isaiah, but this time the situation is they've been carried off into captivity in Babylon and being promised that a remnant will come back. From 56 to the end of the book is a third period where the people are back in the land, back in Jerusalem, and trying to do a restart. And the material of the book of Isaiah is these individuals who've been called by God to speak to the people a message from him. And those messages have two things about them. One, they speak to the current event, and they also kind of have a second level of meaning where they're speaking about things that are to come later on. Many of those things that are to come later on find their fulfillment in Jesus. So one of the things that's distinctive about Christians that is not true of anybody other than Christians is when they read the Old Testament, when they read the Hebrew Bible, the Christians start, it's almost like a pair of glasses, okay? If you put these glasses on, they bend light and you see through this lens. Christians read the Old Testament Bible through the lens of Jesus Christ. And they begin to realize that from the beginning, God knew that humanity would fall into sin, and God had a plan that would account for that, pull all of the pieces back together again, redeem them, repair them, restore them, so that nothing is lost, and then history will move forward after that great moment. And that's what the prophecies in the Old Testament and in the New Testament are all about, and they all point eventually to the book of Revelation. So today we're talking, read the story of the time in the land with the Assyrians in the 9th century before, or 8th century before Christ, and in the 6th century before Christ with the Babylonians, and then the return. It's the return that has the people setting up the Israel that we read about in the New Testament. So that's enough for today. I'm hoping to give you an overview of the Bible.